Hi, my name's David Leech. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Religion and Theology here at Bristol.
Thank you for joining us today. What are we going to be talking about?
Religious and mystical experience.
Could you explain what they are?
Sure, yeah. So people have experiences which are a bit extraordinary, right, relative to their normal experiences, and which have a kind of religious significance for them, or religious or spiritual significance for them. They often make such an impression on people that they remember them all of their lives. They say often it's a turning point for them in their lives. Maybe it makes their behaviour change in certain ways in a positive direction. They feel like it is a revelation of truth in some sense, that it's given them a deeper understanding of the nature of reality.
Are there many problems that people who claim they've had religious experience encounter? Are people quite sceptical?
Sure, yeah, people are sceptical who, let's say, an individual who hasn't had a religious or spiritual or mystical experience, right? These terms are, not, there isn't a consensus about to define all these terms, but this sort of extraordinary experience with religious or spiritual significance. Someone who hasn't had one of those, encountering someone who has had one of those, can naturally be a bit sceptical, right? And think that that person's had experience which isn't tracking how things are, which is not tracking how reality really is, but is just some kind of beautiful illusion that they had, right? But doesn't tell them anything about reality.
Yes.
Because they haven't had the experience, right? So if they themselves had such an experience, then they might feel, indeed, this is something which tells us something about the nature of reality. Or they might not. I mean, on the other hand, there are people who've, in fact, there have been some famous atheist philosopher. There's an atheist philosopher, A.J. Ayer, who had not strictly a religious or spiritual experience, but he had a near-death experience, right, which is in the same general neighbourhood of these experiences. But he didn't draw from it any conclusion about reality being religious or the possibility of him surviving physical death, right? He didn't draw those conclusions.
That's interesting.
But during the course of having the experience, he said it felt like it had that kind of self-authenticating quality of telling him that there was some deeper meaning or significance to reality, and that perhaps there was survival of death.
And is there much empirical evidence for these experiences?
There's an archive called the Anastasia Archive, and that has collected since the 60s reports from ordinary people about these experiences. They used to advertise them in magazines and say, if you've had an experience of this kind, they'd define it. People could write in and share their experience with them, and so there are over 6,000, I think, of these reports in the archive to date.
And what's the relationship between religious experiences and out-body experiences?
There isn't a consensus about how to define them or how to kind of distinguish them from some of the experiences which are extraordinary in certain respects. People do sometimes claim to have out-of-body experiences where they kind of, as it were, astral travel, it's sometimes said, right? They leave their body, go about places, come back to their body, or they float up above themselves, see themselves from above, in a kind of second body, if you like. They don't necessarily have religious or spiritual significance. They may do, but they might not have the features which are normally associated with religious and spiritual experience, like having a deeply transformative effect on the person, or they're remembering those experiences for the rest of their lives, or counting it as one of the most important experiences of their lives, or it having an ineffable quality so they can't put it into words. Those experiences might not have that sort of quality. They won't necessarily have any religious content, for instance, but they're certainly extraordinary experiences.
Yeah, and for example, near-death experiences.
Yeah.
When people have those out-of-body experiences, then is there any medical reasons available for that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are attempts to explain the kind of phenomenology of them, like the content of them, in terms of a deprivation of oxygen to the brain, as the brain is basically sort of shutting down, close to physical death, or after an extreme physical insult or something like that. There's quite a bit of controversy about whether those naturalistic explanations can really explain the phenomenology fully and properly and adequately. So, for example, the tunnel effect, right, that people experience themselves often in near-death experiences as going along a tunnel with
Yes.
light at the end. That's sometimes there are attempts to explain that in terms of anoxia, right, the deprivation of oxygen to the brain,
And
producing certain sort of tunnel-like effects and things.
Right.
But those who've kind of looked very carefully at the phenomenology of these near-death experiences will often kind of point to elements of them which aren't really adequately explained by this general kind of oxygen deprivation or other similar physical explanations.
And going back to religious experiences, what might people encounter? Is there an object? And what's the difference between Western and in Eastern religion?
Let's say someone who has been brought up in a particular religious tradition, let's say they're brought up Christian or Jewish or Muslim, like they might have a theistic type mystical experience, religious or mystical experience. That's to say they might understand the experience as an experience of God. Now, someone who's, let's say, Buddhist might have a extraordinary experience of this kind, but interpret it as an experience of sunyata, right, of emptiness, or of Buddha nature or something like that. So on the face of it, it looks like the objects of these experiences are different, but there are different ways of accounting for what's going on here. And like one of them is, for example, Stephen Katz, and he says, in effect, when people have an experience of God or of Buddha nature or whatever, it's sort of a reflection of the socio-religious culture that they've grown up in and been socialized in, and then when they have such an experience, it is an extraordinary experience, but its content is shaped by the culture that they have grown up in and been socialized into.
What do you think that says about religious experiences? Do you think it takes some validity away from them?
Some people would see it that way, yeah. Some people would say, well, it's just the culture talking, basically. Like it's it's the socio-religious conditioning that the person had, which is reflected in the experience.
Yes.
And that's it. There isn't a God that they've experienced, or there isn't emptiness itself which they've experienced. There is the truth question, right, which we've kind of been approaching here anyway. Is there any reason to suppose that these experiences track reality as such, right? Do they tell us something which maybe we don't have other means of finding out about reality through, except via these experiences, and perhaps these experiences give us a kind of direct, immediate knowledge of the depth of reality in some sense, right, of the religious dimension of reality, something like that. And one issue here is that, well, the experience has a kind of validity for the person who's had it, as you were saying before, right? But for someone who hasn't had it, it doesn't have validity unless they are convinced that they should believe what that person says, or they should believe what that person says unless they have really good reasons not to. But it tends to be that it's the person who's had the experience who finds it kind of self-authenticating, as people sometimes say. Let's say it authenticates itself, right? If you have the experience, you sort of know it's true, right? Immediately, right? You don't have to think about it and, is it true? Let me test whether it's true. It just comes with the impression that it's true.
And do you think religious experiences themselves can be used as empirical evidence for the existence of a greater being?
They can be and have been, right, in the sense that sort of different philosophers of religion have attempted to use these experiences as evidence for that which they believe in and wish to defend, right, the existence of. So, yes, sure, it's certainly been used traditionally as a source of evidence. The difficulties with using it as a source of evidence are things like that, okay, let's say I'm Christian, I have an experience which seems to be an experience of Jesus or of God or whatever, but let's say I encounter a Buddhist, and this is the problem of what's sometimes called the problem of epistemic peer disagreement, right, in the sense that let's say I'm well informed about my own tradition, I'm a sincere person who's not making up stories when I say I've had an experience of God or whatever in it. But then I encounter someone who's, let's say, Muslim or Buddhist or Taoist or something, and they say they've also had one of these experiences, and it also authenticates what they believe, right? So and there's no reason. Let's say you have a third person observing me talking to the Taoist or the Buddhist, but they themselves don't yet have a religious position or stance, and they're looking to kind of figure out whether they should become a Christian or a Taoist or a Buddhist. Well, there's a problem of epistemic peer disagreement, right? All 2 or 3 of us have had one of these experiences. The content of the experience suggested to each one of us that their own tradition was validated in its truth.
Yes.
And so if you're standing on the outside looking on, how do you know which tradition to embrace on the basis of that?
Yeah,
they're all making the same claim. But
and is it common for non-religious people to actually have something that they would call a religious experience?
Well, that's a good question. So there is a small literature on what are called atheistic experiences, or experiences of non-presence, or different ways of referring to it. But basically the idea is that some atheists claim that they have an experience of God's absence, which is not just not finding God, but it's, or let's say God, or you could extend that to, or any religious reality, right? And they say they don't just not find that reality as though if they looked a bit longer they would find it, but they have an experience of the non-existence of a religious reality. Atheists who argue from that experience of the non-existence, like the immediate felt experience, there is no religious reality, it simply is a naturalistic reality that we live in or whatever. They would say that, well, if the religious person can appeal to one of these extraordinary experiences in defense of the truth of their religious position, then as an atheist I can also refer to these sort of experiences of the non-existence of religious reality also in defense of the truth of my position, which is of atheism.
What about drugs relationships to religious experiences? How do hallucinogenics kind of play into that?
Yeah, that's a good question, because the phenomenology of these experiences is such that they often resemble, or quite closely, or sometimes very closely, the phenomenology of experiences which result from taking psychedelic drugs. Therefore the question arises, is there some sort of very close connection between these two? If somebody, let's say, takes one of these drugs and has an experience which is of great religious or spiritual significance for them, is that somehow invalidated by the fact that they had the experience as a result of taking the drug, right? Because a lot of people's intuitions would go like this. Religious and spiritual experiences maybe arise from, let's say, a long commitment to a practice of, let's say, meditation or meditational practice, or of prayer, of contemplative prayer, or something like that. However, a lot of people's intuitions, a lot of people do not find it intuitive that someone, as it were, taking a pill, right, and having one of these experiences has had a genuine religious or spiritual experience. It somehow cheapens it to think that it could be a genuine experience when it has resulted simply from taking a pill or something. However, some philosophers of these experiences, who have looked closely and engaged with these experiences, have suggested that we shouldn't be overly focused on the manner in which someone came to have one of them. So let's say one person has an experience like that because they took a pill, whereas someone else has an experience like that because they spent 20 years in meditational practice or something. But it doesn't matter, right? If the experience is self-authenticating and feels to the person who's had it as though it is a real and genuine experience, revealing how things really are, right? And as kind of a revelation of religious truth, whatever. The fact that someone took a pill to achieve that experience of truth doesn't invalidate it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question, but in principle, some people say in principle, the means by which someone has the experience doesn't invalidate the experience. The experience should be evaluated based on its intrinsic qualities, if you like, rather than how it happened to occur to someone. And the other thing I might say, you're asking, is there anything else? There are various sort of naturalistic attempts to explain these experiences, and it's as well to just say that, that it's not as though there are no naturalistic ways of trying to explain them. they may or may not be fully adequate in terms of explaining all the phenomenology of the experiences, but there are naturalistic explanations of them out there, right? In terms of, that, like I say, in terms of near-death experiences, that it could be as a result of anoxia and processes like that. Stephen Katz would, as I say, argue that it's basically a kind of reflection of the culture. The culture strongly shapes or even determines the content of these experiences. So yeah, there are sort of ways of explaining them other than by saying there must be a religious or spiritual reality which explains them.
Okay, well that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for teaching us about religious experiences today.
Great, thank you.